Hi there, global citizens. You are welcome to today's broadcast on bank reports from the U.S. concerning its dollar state and the impending dangers that may lie ahead of the dollar following de-dollarization. Do not budge. Relax and watch as we take you down this path in the next couple of minutes. While the BRICS alliance is strengthening its banking system, the U.S. seems to be on a downhill trajectory. In the last 3 years alone, 15 U.S. banks collapsed, renewing fears of financial instability across the country. The BRICS bloc has pushed de-dollarization efforts, especially since expanding its numbers. Now the pressure is mounting on the US dollar, as the country's banks face over $500 billion in unrealized losses, according to a new report. A finance expert at Florida Atlantic University revealed that the United States' unrealized losses on investment securities are over $500 billion as of the end of Q2 2024. This is a slight downtrend from the first quarter of the year, a decrease to $513 billion from $516 billion. However, it's still a significant loss for one of the strongest economies in the world. Banks are now saddled with more than $500 billion on their balance sheets. The development shows that U.S. banks are at risk, while the central banks of BRICS are massively accumulating gold to hedge against the US dollar. Rebel Cole, Ph.D., Lynn Eminent Scholar, chaired professor of finance in FAU's College of Business, says that despite the slight downtrend in unrealized losses for banks between quarters, US banks aren't in the clear. The 10-year Treasury yield has been extraordinarily volatile for the past 2 years as inflation has increased. Banks are also affected by their exposure to uninsured deposits, so the combination of unrealized losses and exposure to uninsured deposits can be particularly pernicious. This combination can be especially lethal as the US dollar suffers from inflation and BRICS pressure. The growing US debt and bank losses weaken the US dollar and economy against BRICS. Furthermore, the United States debt has continued to rise this year past its all-time high. The current debt nationwide sits at over $35.7 trillion. Over the last 3 days alone, the debt has surged by a noticeable $345 billion. The U.S. government is currently paying $3 billion in interest on its debt per day. The increased debt and unrealized losses are only putting more pressure on the U.S. economy, causing chagrin among U.S. investors, but to the pleasure of BRICS. While the unrealized losses are only on the balance sheets, they could become a liability when the banks require liquidity. This puts the U.S. banking system under pressure as BRICS continues dumping U.S. treasuries and the dollar. The BRICS alliance is also spearheading the de-dollarization movement by convincing developing countries to end reliance on the dollar. With more countries looking to dethrone the greenback, further pressure could be put on U.S. banks, and thus the entire U.S. economy. Growing pressure for a new global currency comes after the continued weaponization of the US dollar in the form of sanctions and trade wars. Many countries are seeking greater independence from the US financial system. For decades, the United States has been considered the global hegemon. However, BRICS nations now account for more than 40% of the world's population and have an aggregated global GDP of 31.5%. This surpasses the G7's, United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, GDP of 30.7%. It's conceivable to see BRICS nations becoming entirely self-sufficient, trading among themselves without any reliance on the United States. As reliance on US dollars diminishes, central banks have since 2023 been dumping their dollar reserves. This has led to hyperinflation, a spike in interest rates to compensate for the loss of purchasing power and falling asset prices, further accelerating U.S. decline. The trend of de-dollarization is occurring, but it is not unique. Let's take a look at why the world is turning away from the U.S. dollar. The invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 prompted the U.S. Treasury Department to impose unprecedented sanctions on Russia, to hold it accountable for its premeditated and unprovoked invasion. The aim was to prevent Russia from propping up its rapidly depreciating currency by restricting global supplies of the ruble and access to reserves that Russia may try to exchange to support the ruble. In other words, Russia wouldn't be able to sell enough US dollars in the foreign exchange market to buy up Russian currency and bolster its value. Indeed, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen called this an unprecedented action that would significantly limit Russia's ability to use assets to finance its destabilizing activities. Freezing a sovereign country's dollar holdings, Russia's in this case, is a seismic event. It risks accelerating a move away from the use of the US dollar for trade or investment by countries that have different geopolitical interests than the US, such as China or the Gulf states. In fact, several governments outside the West are exploring ways to reduce their exposure to the dollar. Russia is currently settling a quarter of its international trade using Chinese renminbi, and its bilateral trade with China is almost entirely settled in the two countries' respective currencies. In March 2023, China settled a payment for UAE gas in its own currency rather than US dollars for the first time. Then in November, China and Saudi Arabia signed a currency swap agreement, citing a desire to expand the use of their currencies. There are more troubling signs for the US dollar. Even though central banks' foreign exchange reserves have been growing steadily year on year for more than 20 years, the percentage held in US dollars reached its lowest point in the fourth quarter of 2022. Leaving the US behind? The US economy's share in the world's output is falling as emerging economies, especially China, continue to outgrow the US and its Western partners. China, the US's biggest economic competitor, is now the main trading partner to more than 120 countries, with exports amounting to more than 3.6 trillion pounds, $2.8 billion. This risks leaving the US behind in the race for global trade dominance. Over the last 20 years, China's share of the global economy has more than doubled from 8.9% to 18.5%, while the US's share declined from 20.1% to 15.5%, in purchasing power parity terms, which compare prices of specific goods to determine currency purchasing power. Last year, the BRICS economies, fast-growing developing countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, overtook those of the G7, developed economies US, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and Germany, based on their share of world GDP in purchasing power parity terms. As more countries join BRICS, it will give the group even more economic clout. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy's global GDP share is falling, and its debt is hitting new heights as it issues more treasury bills, notes, and bonds to fund current government spending. The U.S. national debt stands in excess of $33 trillion, or 123% of the country's annual output. Inflationary shocks, followed by interest rate increases, have made servicing this debt very expensive for U.S. taxpayers, repeatedly raising the risk of a debt default in recent years. There is no doubt that the US dollar still dominates world markets right now, accounting for most of the transactions in international trade. Its share in the foreign exchange market is colossal at 88% of transactions, and it remains the most widely held international reserve by central banks that want to ensure they can cover their country's imports and support the value of their own currencies. But the centrality of the US currency since the Second World War has not always been welcome. Certainly not by US foes, and sometimes not even by its friends. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the 20th president of France and a finance minister in the 1960s, called the dollar's reserve status an exorbitant privilege for the US. He probably meant that demand for US assets from abroad was so high that it could borrow easily at favorable terms to finance its current account deficit, a privilege not available to other nations. Current global geopolitical and economic shifts could now see this exorbitant privilege challenged. The refusal of Russia's BRICS partners and many UN nations to undertake Western-style sanctions against Russia is evidence of the limitations the West faces in exerting geopolitical influence. And from an economic perspective, China, as the world's top trader, and Russia, as one of the world's richest countries by energy reserves, have amassed large gold holdings, which could replace some US dollar uses. Both are looking to work with other countries, including those in the Gulf region, to reduce reliance on the US dollar. This is where we wrap things for today. We hope you found this video enjoyable. Do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel as part of supporting what we do. Goodbye for the time being.